My name is Justin Neely, and Kansas is in a crisis. I come from a family of educators. My mother works for Kansas Wildlife and Parks and educates children on wildlife and archery. I have an aunt who works special education, an uncle who works special education, an uncle who's a professor, and both of my grandparents were also teachers. So this crisis of the Kansas education budget is very near and dear to me. Well, who's to blame? It should be no surprise that Sam Brownback and the Education Committee are directly a part of the problem. When Sam Brownback first was elected, one of the first things he did was a blitzkrieg tax cut to businesses and income tax. When you get rid of a huge source of revenue like business tax and income tax, somewhere else needs to make it up, or you need to cut money from somewhere else to make up for that money. Well, the conservatives decided that cutting education was the best bet. Now, I don't feel like cutting money from education is a very conservative idea, because being conservative, you follow traditions, orthodox ideals. Cutting education is essentially messing up the future for a short-term gain, which is completely against conservative ideals. So, with this crisis, Republicans will refute it by saying, well, Kansas spends over 50% of its state's revenue in Kansas education. There's only 5 states in the nation that spend more money in education than Kansas. Well, for K through 12, of that 50+%, only about 37.5% is for K through 12. But that's not really the argument. Our crisis is we don't have teachers, and the budget itself is skewed. We can throw a bunch of money at a problem, but if our budget doesn't line up and have money in the right areas to pay for what needs to be done, then there's no point to the budget at all. So why do we have such a shortage of teachers? Where do we have the shortage of teachers? Most of the shortage of teachers is in the STEM classes, our science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. Rightfully so. Most people that get those degrees can end up going somewhere and making significantly more money than a teacher's salary. There's no real incentive for them to become a teacher in the first place, especially not to become a part of this crazy Kansas education fiasco. So the Republicans' idea to try and fill these 700 plus empty teaching slots was the Coalition of Innovative Schools. The idea is good, but it will fail. The Coalition of Innovative Schools says, and you can read this on their website, that a school at any one time can bypass state laws to hire teachers. So what does that mean then? Well, to put it simply, that means that they don't have to have a teaching license or teaching certificate at all to even teach these kids. So that means that these people who have no teaching experience are going to come in and teach these kids. Now, I don't know about you, but I've had a few bad teachers in my day. One of them being my Calc 1 professor here at KU. He was so disassociated from the class that the average on our midterms and finals were 30 to 40%. 30 to 40%. was brilliant. He wouldn't be working at KU as a math professor if he wasn't. But he could not teach. Just because you put in an educated person to teach someone doesn't mean they know how to teach. So what schools have these rules? What schools are a part of the Coalition of Innovative Schools? Well, to list a few, there's Marysville, Concordia, and Blue Valley. Ooh, Blue Valley. Blue Valley is actually one of the #1 schools in Kansas. So Republicans thought that it would be a pretty solid move to open up, hey, you can work in Blue Valley to teach these STEM classes. But, as I mentioned before, if they don't know how to teach, you're not putting a teacher in the position, and they'll be gone within a year. So, for what reason should we all care about this crisis in Kansas in the first place? Well, if you're a Kansas resident, that's your tax dollars. So I think that's a pretty good incentive. Also, if you have any children or relatives who are going through the Kansas education system, I think you should probably be aware of the problems going on right now. You should be aware of the cuts that Sam Brownback and the education committees are making. So, what my challenge for everyone is that I know no one's gonna go out there, write a bill, protest, or anything. I think the best thing for Kansans to do is to go out, research, and look at everything objectively. Because one of the most important things to change this problem is to look at something objectively, not for a Republican agenda, not for a Democratic agenda. We need to look at things for the future of Kansas. We can't be thinking short-term fixes like the Coalition of Innovative Schools.